guys, I am Joy and you're watching my YouTube channel Universal Joy. In this video, we'll be talking about one of the most difficult and one of the most ambiguous topics of respiratory system known as oxygen hemoglobin dissociation association curve. So we'll be learning that, but before moving into the video, if you are new to this channel, then your first honors is going to be to get yourself subscribed to our channel as soon as possible, as early as possible, and hit that bell icon below as well so that you don't miss any single video of our channel. Now without much further ado, let's just get into the videos. So in this video, we'll be talking about the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation association curve. But before moving into the video, first of all, you have to have a good rudimentary knowledge as to the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation association curve. So basically, this graph is nothing but a graphical representation showing the relationship between the percent saturation of the hemoglobin with the partial pressure of the oxygen. Now, as this graph has to be drawn by us in the exam hall, so definitely we have to draw it two-dimensionally. And as usual, in the two-dimensional graphs, there are two axes. One is x-axis, another one is y-axis. So let us assume that this horizontal axis represents x-axis, and across this x-axis will insert the partial pressure of the oxygen, and this longitudinal or vertical axis represents y-axis, and across this y-axis we'll plot the hemoglobin saturation, which will be expressed in terms of the percent. Now what do I mean by hemoglobin saturation and how hemoglobin binds with the oxygen? We have to understand that particular thing first before moving into the graphical representation of the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. Now basically, oxygen, four molecules of the oxygen bind with the single hemoglobin compound, and hemoglobin is a tetrameric compound. So I'm not going to be showing you the microscopic structure of the hemoglobin because then it will look very cumbersome for you. But for your clear visualization and also for your clear conception, I'm going to be showing you a diagram through which you can relate the structure of the hemoglobin very well. Let us just suppose this is a hemoglobin molecule which has got four different pockets. These concave depressions indicate that these are the pockets of the hemoglobin. How many pockets does hemoglobin carry? Okay, how many pockets does this hemoglobin have? It has got four pockets. And let's just suppose this is pocket number 1, pocket number 2, pocket number 3, and this is our pocket number 4. Now, at every pocket, oxygen will be bound to every pocket. So this is the first molecule of the oxygen which will remain attached to the first pocket of the hemoglobin. Now similarly, this is the second molecule of the oxygen which will be sticky to the second pocket of the hemoglobin. So same way, third molecule of the oxygen will be attached to the third pocket of the hemoglobin, and fourth oxygen will remain attached to the fourth pocket of the hemoglobin. So this is how oxygen remains attached to the hemoglobin. This is the affinity of the oxygen with hemoglobin, or conversely you can say this is the affinity of the hemoglobin with oxygen. This is how oxygen loves to be attached to the hemoglobin's pocket. Okay, now when I say hemoglobin is 100% saturated, what do you mean by that? Hemoglobin is 100% saturated. It means that all the pockets of the hemoglobin here, four pockets of the hemoglobin, are loaded with the oxygen. The moment I ask you what do you mean by 75% of the saturation of the hemoglobin, you would say that means out of four pockets, three pockets of the hemoglobin are loaded with oxygen and one pocket remains unattached with the oxygen. If I ask, or if somebody comes in and asks you what do you mean by 50% of the saturation of the hemoglobin, then you got to say 50% of the saturation of the hemoglobin means that means oxygen, 2 moles of the oxygen will remain attached to the two pockets of the hemoglobin, and two pockets of the hemoglobin will remain empty, will be devoid of the oxygen. Okay, and usually at partial pressure 100, we get to see 4 oxygens combining with the 4 different pockets of the hemoglobin. When does this phenomenon take place? When the partial pressure of the oxygen is 100. Okay, because we have already come across earlier that when the partial pressure of the oxygen is increased, hemoglobin saturation is also increased. Okay, so basically across the x-axis, I'm going to be drawing, or I'm going to be plotting the partial pressure of the oxygen. So let us start our journey from the 0 level as usual. So every graph starts its journey from the 0 level. So we'll also start our journey from the 0 level. And after 0 level, let's just suppose this is our 5 millimeter of the mercury. This is 10 millimeter of the mercury. The partial pressure, not 10 actually, as I've written 5, so I should be writing 15. Okay. And let's just suppose this is, going to be indicating 25. This point indicates 30. This indicates 40, this point indicates 50, over here is 60 millimeter of the mercury, over here 70, then this way the graph moves, on and on and on. So here you could see an imbalance of the partial pressure of the oxygen, because I've tried my level best to make this graph a little easier for you. I've written down the partial pressure of the oxygen very randomly, very whimsically, so that it becomes a little easier for you and easier for your visualization. But when you will draw it in your exam hall or in your exam paper, you got to be maintaining a similar kind of distance from every pressure. You got to be writing down in in a sequential manner. But for your clear conception, I've just written down the pressure of the oxygen very randomly so that it becomes easier for you. Now across this y-axis we'll be plotting the saturation. So let us just suppose that this is 100 millimeter of the mercury, or rather I should be saying this is 100 percent saturation. This indicates almost like 85% saturation. Let us just suppose this is 50% saturation, and let us just suppose this point over here indicates 75% of the saturation. Now when I say 75% saturation, it means 3 of the oxygen molecule remains attached to the hemoglobin. The moment I say 50% saturation of the hemoglobin with oxygen, it means that 2 molecules of the oxygen will be remaining attached to the 2 pockets of the hemoglobin, and 2 pockets of the hemoglobin will remain devoid of the oxygen. Okay, now as I've already mentioned earlier, that when the partial pressure of the oxygen is closer to 100 or is more than 100, then there will be 100% saturation of the hemoglobin. That means all the 4 pockets of the hemoglobin will now be loaded with oxygen. So if the partial pressure is 100 or somewhere closer to 100, or if it is more than 100 like 110 or 120, that means all the pockets of the hemoglobin will remain attached to the oxygen molecule. So here, over here we'll get 100, and also over here we'll be getting 100. So our first point will be drawn somewhere around this. Okay, so this is our first point, because we know at partial pressure 100 will get 100% of the saturation of the hemoglobin. So across x-axis we'll move to 100, and across y-axis we'll move to 100. So our first point will be drawn somewhere around this place. Okay, now what is the next point? The next point is that experiments have shown us that if you drop the partial pressure of the oxygen from 100 millimeter of the mercury up to 50 millimeter of the mercury, then there will be no more huge amount of the fluctuations of the affinity of the hemoglobin with oxygen. What does it mean? It means that this was supposed to be our hemoglobin molecule, and let's just compare this hemoglobin molecule with a husband, with a very faithful husband. Okay, and let's just suppose this is oxygen. Okay, and let's just compare this oxygen with wife, and both of them are very faithful and committed couple with each other. So hemoglobin is so committed to its wife that it is very much going to be showing no interest in throwing the oxygen, even if you drop the pressure of the partial pressure of the oxygen from 100 to 50. So this much of the change, okay, that means from 60 to 100, how much is the pressure difference? It's 40 millimeter of the mercury. Okay, and if you count from 50, then it becomes 50 millimeter of the mercury. So for our better for our better conception, or for our better calculation, we'll measure the difference of the partial pressure of the oxygen from 60 to 100. So from 60 to 100, the partial pressure of the oxygen's difference is 40 millimeter of the mercury. So from 100 to 60, if you keep on decreasing the pressure of the pressure of the oxygen, yet hemoglobin will remain attached to the oxygen because it is committed to its wife. It is not going to be showing any kind of zeal or any kind of enthusiasm in throwing this oxygen because it is very faithful to its wife. Okay, that means for a bear of word, if we drop 10 millimeter of the mercury in terms of the pressure from 100, and if we move on to 90 from 100, then still we'll find almost 99% of the hemoglobin remaining attached to the oxygen molecule. 99% of the hemoglobin will be saturated. That means 99% can be denoted over here somewhere closer to 100. So our second point will also be around the first point. So there is a reason behind the drawing of the second point closer to the first point, because if we keep on decreasing the pressure of the oxygen from 100 to 60 millimeter of the mercury, during between this space, or at in this place, the hemoglobin is very much faithful to its wife, that it is not going to be showcasing any kind of phenomenon to throw its wife away from its own four hands. Okay, that's the major reason why majority of the hemoglobin will be found to be saturated with oxygen. Okay, now let us draw the third point. Now from 90, I'm going to be decreasing the pressure to a bigger amount. Let's just suppose I'm going to be decreasing the pressure to 60 millimeter of the mercury. Now as you have already decreased the pressure to a huge amount, so definitely the desaturation of the hemoglobin will be also in a bigger amount, but it will not be in so big amount that it will be pulled down to like 50% of the saturation or 25% of the saturation. If I move through this direction, that means if I move to my left and move to the point of 60 millimeter of the mercury from 100 millimeter of the mercury, then I'll get to see still 80% of the hemoglobin remaining saturated with oxygen, because of the same reason, because at this place hemoglobin is very much committed to its wife, which is oxygen. Okay, so still I'll be saying that 80% of the hemoglobin remaining attached to the oxygen. So at pressure 60, we'll get to see the saturation level at around 85%. Okay, so this is the third point. Okay, now at 50, we'll see hemoglobin to be saturated with oxygen, but this time, as I have already decreased the pressure to a huge extent, that means I've already come to my half path, or I've already come to my midway. That is why hemoglobin will be releasing one of its oxygen from one of its pocket, and it will be 75% saturated. That means if I drop my pressure from 100 to 50, okay, or somewhere closer to 40, okay, then I'll be getting approximately 75% saturation of the hemoglobin. Now after 40, if I keep on decreasing the partial pressure of the oxygen across the x-axis, then this hemoglobin will no longer be showing any kind of faithfulness to its wife. That means if I decrease my partial pressure of the oxygen in such a way that it exceeds the pressure called 40 millimeter of the mercury, then hemoglobin will no longer be faithful to its wife. Then hemoglobin will no longer be committed to oxygen. Rather, it becomes less associated with oxygen, and it becomes a very strong dissociator for oxygen. So it starts removing oxygen very rapidly from its pocket. Okay, so what really happens is that from here on, hemoglobin will be releasing oxygen very rapidly. Okay, so ultimately I'm going to be adding these parts to complete my oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. Okay, now this is my oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. Okay, I should be drawing it with the same color, otherwise it becomes a little dirty. Okay, this is my oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. So at 100 we had 100% of the saturation, at 90 we had 99% of the saturation, at 60 we had approximately 85% of the saturation, at 40 we had 75% of the saturation, and after 40, for each millimeter of the mercury of the pressure change towards the x-axis or across the x-axis, we'll have a rapid fall down of the saturation of the hemoglobin, and it becomes a strong dissociator and less associator with the oxygen, and the graph shows a huge fall. Okay, now we have to learn the right shift and left shift of this very same graph. When will the right shift take place? Another thing that I've missed, at 25 millimeter of the mercury, okay, at 25 millimeter of the mercury, 50% of the hemoglobin remains saturated and 50% of the hemoglobin remains unsaturated. Okay, what does it mean? That means if this is our hemoglobin 4-pocket sitter, 2 of the molecules will be sitting on 2 pockets of the hemoglobin, and 2 pockets of the hemoglobin will remain empty. At which pressure? when we drop the pressure up to 25 millimeter of the mercury, or between 25 to 28 millimeter of the mercury, this is an area where hemoglobin will be 50% saturated, and or in another way you can say this is an area where hemoglobin will be 50% desaturated. Same thing. Okay, now what do you mean by right shift and what do you mean by left shift the curve? Very simple. When, let's just suppose this is our tissue or this is our cell and this is a blood vessel. Okay, and this, due to the metabolic purpose, the cells will definitely be producing carbon dioxide to a huge extent, and inside the blood vessel definitely there is the presence of the RBC. Let us just suppose this is our RBC. Okay, and what really happens, this RBC will contain hemoglobin. That means yet there will be 4 pockets of the hemoglobin. So this carbon dioxide from the cell will be moving into the interior part of the RBC, and in the RBC it will be generating carbonic acid, and this carbonic acid will be dissociating, and due to the dissociation of the carbonic acid there will be the production of the H plus and also what? Also bicarbonate ion. So when there is increased amount of the carbon dioxide production by the cell, there will all this increased amount of the production of the carbon dioxide will also lead to the increased amount of the production of the H plus, and this H plus, and we knew before the entry of this H plus or before the production of the H plus, 4 oxygens. Okay, I should be enlarging this picture, otherwise you will not be able to get it. Okay, again, this is our cell which is going to be producing carbon dioxide. Let's just suppose this is our blood. Okay, it is going to be having a huge RBC, and within this huge RBC there was this 4-seater hemoglobin where oxygen, 4 molecules of the oxygen were attached to 4 different pockets of the hemoglobin. Okay, now as your tissues are exercising due to the metabolic purpose, or let's just say you are sprinting, or you are walking very rapidly, or you are swimming, or you are in a very heavy exercise, that time there will be an increased amount of the carbon dioxide in your cellular level. From the cell it will be moving inward to your blood vessel, and from the plasma of the blood it will shift to your RBC, and within the RBC it binds with the H2O, and in the presence of carbonic anhydrous enzyme it produces H2CO3, then suddenly it dissociates and then it leads to the formation of H plus and bicarbonate ion. And what really happens is that this H plus, now you can see before the incoming of this H plus, hemoglobin and oxygen, they were very, very close to each other. That means their bond was very stronger. Okay, and they were a very good couple, honest to each other, and they would not hide any kind of matter from each other before the incoming of this H plus. Now hemoglobin, let's just suppose this couple has passed 10 years, and after the 10 years this husband has seen a new woman, very attractive woman in the form of H plus. Okay, now this hemoglobin has become very tired of its previous wife, oxygen, so it wants to bind with hydrogen, very attractive one, very newer one, very eye-catchy. Okay, now before the incoming of the hydrogen, this hemoglobin was very, very faithful to its wife, but as it has seen a new wife in the form of hydrogen, so it starts an affair with H plus, which is illegitimate, and it binds with hydrogen and throws its previous wife oxygen out of its one pocket. Okay, so there will be a release of the oxygen from one pocket of the hemoglobin, and this oxygen goes into the cell. Okay, and this hydrogen binds with the hemoglobin. Okay, that means when there is increased production in the CO2 or increased production of the H plus, and we know increased production of the H plus leads to the decrease of the pH. So when there is increased production of the H plus, decrease of the pH level, increase of the carbon dioxide, and when your tissues are exercising or when your tissues undergo heavy exercise, that time they also produce some acidic materials, for example pyruvic acid, lactic acid, or 2,3-DPG, which is an important component. 2,3-DPG, some of the people call it 2,3-diphosphoglycerate, or many people call it 2,3-BPG instead of saying it DPG. Same thing, however you go by, the same phenomenon will arise in. So some 2,3-DPG diphosphoglyceric acid or 2,3-BPG bisphosphoglyceric acid. Okay, that's a different that will indicate the very same thing. Anyways, when there is increased amount of the production of the carbon dioxide, that will lead to the increased amount of the production of the H plus. and increased amount of the production of the H plus will lead to the decrease of the pH, okay, decrease of the pH. Or when there is increase of the 2,3-DPG or lactic acid or pyruvic acid, that time these structures or these molecules will be helping the hemoglobin to throw its previous wife, which is also oxygen. So hemoglobin will no longer be showing the same affinity with oxygen prior to the production of these molecules. Okay, now hemoglobin remains strongly associated with the newer substances and it becomes weakly bound with the oxygen. So it loves to associate with the newer wives and it loves to dissociate with its previous wife. So it becomes strong dissociator. That means for every change in the partial pressure of the oxygen from 100 millimeter of the mercury, if we keep on decreasing the partial pressure of the oxygen, okay, even by a little inch, then there will be huge amount of the discharge of the oxygen from the hemoglobin. Previously, what we had learned is that from 100 to 60, if we keep on decreasing the level of the partial pressure of the oxygen, then hemoglobin would not fluctuate much. Hemoglobin would not throw a huge amount of the oxygen if we decrease the partial pressure of the oxygen from 100 to 60 previously in normal condition. But now, as hemoglobin has found out new women, as hemoglobin is doing affairs with other substances, that's the major reason why in this exercising condition, if we keep on decreasing the pressure from 100 to 90 or from 90 to 80, then hemoglobin will be throwing huge amount of the oxygen, which is very unlike event as compared to the normal oxygen dissociation curve. Okay, that means if we reduce the pressure from 100 to 50 millimeter of the mercury this time, then we'll be able to get to see the 50 or rather I should be saying, okay, 50% of the saturation. Okay, that previously at 40 millimeter of the mercury we got 75% of the saturation, but now to be able to get that to 50% of the saturation, okay, 50% of the saturation, when the curve shifts to the right, that time we'll have to reduce the pressure by 50 millimeter of the mercury. Again, previously to be able to get to that 50% of the saturation, we had decreased the pressure by 75 margin, because at 25 millimeter of the mercury we had 50% of the saturation previously in the normal condition. But now, as hemoglobin has become a strong dissociator for oxygen because of the newly substances like hydrogen, carbon dioxide and other substances, so even a little change in the partial pressure of the oxygen across the x-axis will lead to the 50% of the desaturation of the hemoglobin. So the curve will shift to the rightward, and when we decrease the pressure to 50 millimeter of the mercury from 100 millimeter of the mercury, then we'll be able to get to the 50% of the desaturation. Okay, that means the curve will shift to the rightward. Okay, previously in order to get 50% of the saturation, we had reduced the pressure up to 25 millimeter of the mercury from 100 millimeter of the mercury. Now when the curve is moving to the right, we have reduced the pressure up to 40 millimeter of the mercury, and at 40 millimeter of the mercury we have successfully been able to get to the level of the 50% of the desaturation, because it is a strong dissociator at the moment. But when the curve shifts to the left, when does the curve shift to the left? When there will be decreased amount of the production of the H plus, the opposite phenomenon will be observed here, and decreased amount of the production of the carbon dioxide. So if concentration of the H plus reduces, definitely then the pH will be arising upward. Okay, so if the concentration of the H plus goes downward, concentration of the carbon dioxide goes downward, and pH level goes upward, and if there is less amount of the production of the 2,3-DPG or less amount of the production of the lactic acid, pyruvic acid, then hemoglobin will no longer be facing the other women with whom it can bind with. So it will remain attached to its previous wife. So it will remain committed or faithful to its previous wife. So it binds with the oxygen very strongly, it binds with its oxygen very stickly, and it binds with its oxygen very firmly. So it becomes a very strong associator with its wife, and the curve shifts to the left side. That means for every change of the pressure, hemoglobin will try its level best to hold as much of the oxygen as it can, and it will no longer be showing huge amount of the tendency to discharge oxygen out of its own pocket. That means to be able to get to the 50% of the desaturation, you have to decrease huge amount of the pressure across the x-axis, and measurements have shown us if we get to 15 or up to 5 millimeters of the mercury across the x-axis, then and only then we'll be able to get to the level of the 50% of the desaturation, and it will take place when the curve will move to the right. Okay, this is the story of the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. Okay, when the curve shifts to the right, there will be increased amount of the production of the H plus, increased amount of the production of the carbon dioxide, and decreased amount of the pH, decreased amount of the level of the pH when the curve will be shifted to the right side. That means opposite phenomenon will be observed, and in case the curve shifts to the left, there will be reduced amount of the H plus, reduced amount of the carbon dioxide, reduced amount of the huge amount of the pH, and reduced amount of the 2,3-DPG. This will result in the increased amount of the association of the hemoglobin with the oxygen molecule. So to be able to get to the P50, we have to decrease the pressure of the oxygen to a huge extent so that we can get to the 50% of the desaturation of the oxygen molecule. This is how the curve of the oxygen and hemoglobin dissociation curve is drawn. Hope you have liked the video, and I hope that this lecture will be clearing your doubts in every angle. So till the next video, stay tuned, stay blessed, and stay connected to universal joy.